Well, welcome to November's third Thursday training. Tonight, we're going to be taking a look at the employment and compensation standards that are being proposed for 2024 for the Presbytery. But before we do that, let's start with prayer. Please pray with me. Gracious and holy God, we are so grateful for the ways that you walk with us each and every day. And in this season where we may pay a little more attention to gratitude, our thoughts have to return to you again and again for all that you provide, for all that you intend for us to live abundant lives. Be with us this evening as we talk about one of the ways we pass that provision along by caring for those who work within the body of Christ in pastoral roles. So guide us and always keep us returning to you each and every moment of each and every day. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
All right. And welcome, Lance. Glad you're here tonight. I'm going to share my screen so we can walk through this together. This is now posted on our Presbytery Assembly page for the upcoming Presbytery meeting. So if you go to the website, ncpresbytery.org, click on the tab that says Gatherings. Underneath that, one of the options is Assemblies. If you click on that, you'll start to see the reports populating for the meeting on November 28th. And this is now posted there. So every year we update our employment and compensation standards and guidelines. Usually the update is fairly minor and focuses just on any increase to the minimum compensation. This year there's another addition, which we'll look at when we get there. There's a whole table of contents, and so I'll say this now, in preparing for tonight and working on the document to add the pieces for this year, we discovered there's some places where it's in conflict within itself. So those have been noted. We'll probably be bringing an update in May. So just give that disclaimer right up front. We begin with a faithful view of compensation. We want to say really clearly that compensation is tied to what we believe and how we are meant to gather together as the church and what the Bible teaches us. So we're not just doing it because that's what's expected. We're also doing it because the Bible tells us so. And so in that last paragraph, the ability and willingness to compensate a minister is a sign of a congregation's health, vitality, and intention to invest in its ministry and its future. And it is an act of faithful stewardship. It's also stewardship season for a lot of our churches. And so I'll put in my little plug that how we give, the ways in which we approach money in our lives are part of our spiritual disciplines. So they're not something that's set aside, but it's part of our spiritual discipline, how we give back to God, give back to God's people. Okay. And then that very last paragraph, COMC, Commission on Ministers and Congregations, there's one place that needs to be changed. We'll see flexibility as a matter of compassion. We've worked really hard not to be a one-size-fits-all kind of presbytery and say the same thing that works for Westminster and Wilmington will work for Pitts Creek in Pocomoke. That's not faithful, and it's not realistic. So instead, we have guidelines and standards, and within those guidelines and standards, we are open to conversations with churches and with ministers to determine what makes the most sense for everybody in a way that's fair, keeps our focus on justice, but also is realistic. Oh, the normal disclaimers and explanations. I think you all know by now that in Presbyterian language, shall is you must. It is the mandate. I'm not going to go through the rest of those. But if you're ever stumbling over some of the terms, you can go back to this page and be reminded. And then the principles of compensation. And as a church, this is something denomination-wide that we continue to talk about. The Board of Pensions releases a new theology of benefits every year, and they are constantly undergirding why do we offer these benefits with our theology and with what the Bible teaches us. And so the principles of compensation are always being lifted up for us across the church. So it's not just Newcastle Presbytery that's engaged in this. And I'll say, as always, if you have any questions, interrupt me. Yeah, don't wait. And so these principles of compensation are there to help explain why it's important if somebody is questioning, and provide some of the language that sometimes we need, especially in budget season, and especially as churches are concerned about income and expenses, to be able to say, no, there are undergirding principles, fairness, that there's a responsibility to the position of pastor or pastoral leader that is significant. So those are here on that second page. And then some information about the Board of Pensions, the theology of benefits I just mentioned, and the things that are available through them. And then we go to categories. Some of these categories are in conflict. So called and installed, as we see here, what makes an installed position different from the other positions is an installed pastor is voted on by the congregation and is required to participate in the Board of Pensions dues program, which includes medical pension, death, and disability. Any one of you who has heard me say anything about this, a temporary pastoral relationship, is simply our way of saying that the agreement is between the session and the pastor and not the congregation and the pastor. I was in a temporary pastoral relationship that ended up stretching 8.5 years. Others have been in temporary pastoral relationships for decades. Where an installed relationship requires participation in the Board of Pensions full program, and in a temporary, using that language, temporary relationship where the agreement is between pastor and session, and of course always the presbytery. The presbytery is always the third member of that triangle. That is not required to participate in the full dues program. And there are pastors who choose that because they don't need the medical coverage. They're still the pastor of the church. And so that's the thing I really want to stress, that regardless of who the contract is with, who the terms of call are held by, whether it's congregation or session, the person filling the role is the pastoral leader. And the pastoral leader may have a specific set of goals, like a transitional pastoral leader, or a specific understanding, like a bridge pastor. I'll only be here for a few months, but they're still the pastoral leader. They are indeed the real pastor. I keep hoping we'll come up with different language, but that's a different story for another time. Any of these, called and installed or temporary, can be full-time, part-time, any combination thereof. So yeah, the major delineation is who holds the terms of call and the participation in Board of Pension programs. Validated and specialized ministries, as you see, ministers who are serving outside of a congregation. So usually, yeah, not as a pastor of a church, but as a chaplain in a hospital or as a educator. Most of our seminary professors who are Presbyterian have service in validated ministries. I serve in a validated ministry. I'm not a pastor of a church, but my ministry is within the church and is validated as an appropriate ministry. So this presbytery has a wide understanding of what constitutes validated ministries. And so we have validated ministries as public school teachers, as well as hospital chaplains, hospice chaplains. And we've really been willing to say, if this is a call and you are exercising your God-given gifts and talents in that call in a way that is in line with the gifts of a pastor as well, we're willing to talk about validating that. And then we have limited pastoral services, and those are things like pulpit supply or moderating session if the moderator is not available, or between pastors, things like that. Any questions on those categories? All right. And then compensation. Called and installed are not considered to be working in full-time positions. That's another place where this is in conflict within itself. I don't assume that anymore, and we need to change that language. But as I've already said, call and install does create a particular set of requirements. The Board of Pensions uses a 40-hour work week as the standard for full-time, which is lovely. I have yet to meet a full-time pastor who, I won't say that. There are full-time pastors who are very careful with their boundaries for good reason, who work 40 hours a week. Most of us in pastoral ministry don't see 40 hours as a full-time. It's usually more than that. But that is the standard the Board of Pensions uses. So 20 hours a week would be considered half-time. And that gives us at least guidelines when we're talking about less than full-time positions. So this is one of the changes for 2024. We did, and this was approved at the September Presbytery meeting, we did change our total effective salary, the minimum, by raising it 3% to $62,708. And then we use should language here, which is still strong language, but not as strong as shall. We do highly encourage that every pastor, regardless of where they fall in terms of the minimum, every pastor should receive a cost of living adjustment. We all know that if you don't receive a cost of living adjustment to your salary, you actually lose money. You may be making the same dollar amount, but it goes less far. It doesn't stretch as far as inflation drives up prices. So we do highly recommend an annual cost of living adjustment. And this year, that's right around 3%. That's right around 3%. Last year, of course, it was much, much higher, and that was a struggle for everybody. It was a struggle for all of us who were dealing with that rapid inflation, as well as for churches who said, yeah, we're gonna try to keep our pastor ahead of the rise of inflation. We're going to try to keep them ahead of that. I Googled really fast. I don't know if this will end up sharing or if it will just be me who sees it. One of the things we know is that minimum wage across the United States is not enough for a person on minimum wage cannot afford to rent a single bedroom apartment in that place. So minimum wage changes by state. And so whether it's the state with the lowest minimum wage or the highest minimum wage, it's not enough for a single person to rent a place to live. And in Delaware, this was just a quick Google search, required annual income after taxes, 2 adults both working with 1 child, the required annual income is $72,000. So if you are 62,708, if the pastor is the only person working in that household, especially if they have a child, it would be hard for them to be able to afford a 2-bedroom place to live in Delaware. And of course that changes across the state, that there's a lot of variety in housing across the state, but we know affordable housing is a huge issue as well. So just so you kind of have that awareness that even with our minimum effective salary, you would really need 2 adults working to be able to be in a place, have a home, to raise a family. Any questions on that? All right. Now, ministers have this funny thing called housing allowance, which hardly anyone else has access to. There's some provisions for educators. I don't know those provisions as well. I'm just kind of basically aware of them. But for us, for those of us who serve the church, we are able to claim part of our effective salary as a housing allowance. All right, here's the thing. The housing allowance is not subject to income tax, but it is subject to self-employment tax. So it's a benefit, but you still have to pay for it. So you don't get away from it. And there are IRS guidelines for how to calculate how much housing allowance is allowed. So right now, the language we have in here, and here's the other piece that's really, really important. The housing allowance has to be officially designated. So if the terms of call are held by the congregation has to vote on the amount being claimed. That's what makes it official, and that's what helps it rise to the IRS's standards for documentation. If the terms of call are held by the session has to vote on the amount. So it can't just be something that the pastor at the end of the year goes, oh, this is what I'm going to claim for housing allowance. It has to be an action taken by the governing body. All right. And then the guidelines are these: fair rental value of primary residence, furnished, including appurtenances, such as a garage, plus the actual annual cost of utilities, or the amount designated in advance by church or session, or the amount actually spent. Now, no matter what, you have to have the amount designated in advance by church or session. That is required. And then it's the lesser of the following things: either fair rental value or amount actually spent. So if you own a place free and clear, if you don't have a mortgage, then the amount you actually spend will be less than the fair rental value, right? Because you're not paying a mortgage. where the fair rental value, depending on housing fluctuation, the fair rental value may be less, plus all the actual, annual cost of utilities may be less than the amount actually spent because of falling housing costs or something like that. So in those cases, what you can claim as housing allowance when you do your annual taxes, yeah, you have to pay attention to this. So most of us, when we work with a session or congregation, or in my case, that's the Presbytery that sets my housing allowance, we tend to be a little conservative in case things shift. You can always go back and ask for an adjustment. It's not a big deal to go to a congregation if they have the terms of call and say, hey, actually my expenses are going to be more, fair rental value's gone up. Can we change the amount that's designated as housing allowance? Requires a congregational meeting, but it doesn't change the terms of call, doesn't change the money spent by the congregation. It just changes the tax implications for the pastor. So it should be a fairly easy thing to change along the way if circumstances change, if you move, or if housing costs either go up or down, because both have an impact. Does that make sense? Yeah. And of course, the housing allowance for ministers continues to be challenged at the national level as an unfair advantage and against the separation of church and state clause. One of these days, it may be ruled out of order, but for now, it is an advantage offered to those serving in ministry. All right. All right. Then there's the possibility of a manse. And so there's language about what happens if a church is providing a manse. Because our pension with the Board of Pensions and our medical, if our medical is with the Board of Pensions, is based on that effective salary number. Effective salary, if we're living in a manse, has to, and here's the language, has to include at least 30%. I didn't say that quite right. So if I'm being paid a whole salary and part of that is housing allowance, that may be $62,000 using 2024 figures. But if I'm in a manse, the manse can account for 30% of that $62,000. So the cash salary may be closer to $40,000, with the manse being considered effective salary because it's housing and making up that last 20,000. And so that works for our pension. So our pension credits are based on the 60,000 and not the 40,000 cash salary. Same with the medical percentage dues are based on that 60,000, even though 20,000 is the in-kind housing. It's used as part of what the compensation is, because instead of spending that 20,000 for housing, it is a received compensation. Clear as mud. But it does mean that sometimes ministers would prefer not to live in a manse for all kinds of reasons, but living in a manse does not impact the pension accrual. And that's important to be aware of. You're not creating equity in your own home, but it can be hard to buy a home. So I know when I was first out of seminary, I was so grateful to serve a church with a manse, even though people would come knock on my door and ask for the key all the time. I wouldn't have been able to buy a house, and renting in that area would have been difficult. So anyway.
I see presbyteries that have an equity allowance.
Yeah, so
I've never lived in a manse before, so this is new to me.
Yeah. So especially in areas where the housing is just
Okay.
astronomically expensive. So
National capital, this is what I'm looking at as national
yeah,
capital. So,
yeah,
okay.
yeah. So
We
in
don't,
Boston, Presbytery, similarly, the Presbytery had money set aside to enter into an equity sharing agreement to help pastors buy a home because the housing market was just it was like it was impossible. And so that's an option. Newcastle has not done that, but it is something that, as housing continues to be more and more expensive, it is something the Presbytery could look into down the road. And it basically, the way it works is the equity sharing partner, the ways I've experienced, basically put down a percentage as the down payment, which can also help get to a down payment for a first-time home buyer. And then they own that percentage of the equity. So if they put down 10% of the entire purchase price, they own, the Presbytery owns 10% of the property. And so the hope, of course, is the value will increase. And when it comes time to sell, they'll still own 10%, but the 10% will be of a larger portion. Sometimes the property value decreases, and then that 10% remains a 10%, but what that equates to goes down as well. So that's an example of an equity sharing agreement in simple terms. Of course, it's more complicated. Every set of terms of call, regardless of whether it's held by the congregation or the session, will include some kind of professional expense reimbursement plan. And we require a minimum annual budget amount of $2,000. And that can include all kinds of things. That can include, that can help cover meals out with parishioners, or coffee with parishioners, or cell phone expenses, or home Wi-Fi expenses. As a lot of us work from home, we're paying for those utilities, but we're using them on behalf of our ministries. So those professional expenses can be really helpful. And there's more language here about that. But what is worth lifting up is this sentence: by calling it one thing, there's more flexibility. Some churches would prefer to have multiple categories. That's fine. But there is more flexibility if it's called one thing and can cover many things. This was added, this number 4 was added just 2 years
Cindy,
ago now.
before you go to number 4, can I ask you about a sentence in number 3
Yes.
where it says, I think the second sentence, are not considered reportable income by the IRS as long as such expenses are reported to the church within 60 days of being reimbursed. Is that the word that's supposed to be there, or does that mean expensed?
That's another place where, yeah, this is what happens when things are cobbled together. Yeah, so within 60 days of being spent.
Being spent. Oh, okay.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah. Because they should not be reimbursed before they've been reported. Yeah. Watch out, Marge. I may call you to help me with our rewrite. So number 4, like I said, was new 2 years ago. SECA is that self-employment tax. So like I said, housing allowance is not subject to income tax and doesn't count towards income tax, but is part of what ministers pay self-employment tax on. So for most people, like I worked for the Gap for a couple of years when I needed a job between calls, and half of SECA, half, that 50%, came out of my salary, and half was paid by the organization. Ministers fall into a weird tax set of laws, and so by IRS standards, we're considered self-employed, even though we're paid by an organization. Don't ask me how that came up. I don't know. I don't know the history of that. And that's why ministers are expected to pay that SECA. Now, adding this, the 50% of SECA, the church then pays what they would normally pay for any other employee, like the secretary, like a director of music, like a custodian or a groundskeeper. They do that for the pastor as well. The benefit to the church is that 50% of SECA, 7.65% of total effective salary, is not counted as part of Board of Pension dues. So the minister receives it as salary, which should go into the place that they pay taxes out of, and it doesn't get counted in the effective salary for Board of Pensions dues. And then the minister is able to receive that and use it to help offset the tax liability on a quarterly basis. Everyone gets to do this differently, but bottom line is all of our terms of call in the Presbytery include this 50% of SECA. And that's on that form, which is at the end of this packet. We have multiple benefits packages, and early next year, probably our April 3rd Thursday, will be focused on the changes the Board of Pensions is laying out for their benefits plan. They are broadcasting pretty widely, but it's that this is what we think we're going to do, but it hasn't been decided yet. So you should be having conversations about what we think we're going to do, but the decision won't be made till March 2024 and go into effect January 1st, 2025. So what they're broadcasting is effective January 1st, 2025, if it is indeed decided by the Board of Directors of the Board of Pensions, the dues percentage program that's used for called and installed pastors will only provide medical coverage for the pastor. Currently, that provides coverage for the whole family. What they are proposing and working towards is that as of January 1st, 2025, that coverage will only be for the pastor. There will be part of what they're working on is kind of some on-ramp options for families or for spouses who don't have other medical coverage other than through the minister spouse. And we don't know what those things are yet. That's part of what they're working on now. The percentage, which is currently 39%, the bulk of which is for medical, the percentage will go down. We don't know what it'll go down to yet. Anyway, there's a lot of we don't know yet, so stay tuned on this one. But currently, for 2024, for one more year, we have two benefits packages. Pastor's participation, which is that dues program that called and installed pastors are required to participate in, and minister's choice, which is pension, death and disability, and not medical. Okay. Both packages, both pastor's participation and minister's choice, provides access to all the other Board of Pensions programs like CRADO, like seminary debt assistance, like their education programs. So those come along with either benefit package. Pastor's participation is 39%, includes medical for the whole family for one more year. Minister's choice is 10%, does not include medical, and is a choice if you are not called and installed. Even if you are not called and installed, if you're in one of those temporary roles, you can participate in pastor's participation. For instance, Tracy and I at the Presbytery level both have pastor's participation coverage at that 39%. It's only required if you're called and installed, but it's available if you're a pastor in church ministry. And so this goes into more of what that means. Something we're seeing more of, hey there, is this post-retirement service dues. So our honorably retired ministers who have started receiving their pension, if they go back into service above a certain amount. So this is more than just pulpit supply or moderating a session. This is under contract, receiving a certain amount of compensation. They're required to let the Board of Pensions know. Usually pension payments change at that point, and that's a whole nother complicated thing. And the church is required to pay the 12% as post-retirement service dues. So those are the three main categories for pastoral roles in terms of the Board of Pensions. Whew. Okay, we're getting there. This presbytery has this fantastic program called MedWrap, which it only applies if a person is receiving Board of Pensions medical. So there's a whole brochure, check it out. But basically, as part of terms of call, a church with a pastor in the medical program pays 2% of that effective salary to the presbytery, and then at the end of the calendar year, the pastor asks for and receives the spreadsheet of approved medical expenses, submits that to our treasurer, who looks at the numbers and not at anything else, and then, depending on the series of calculations, can receive a check back covering the out-of-pocket expenses. It's really nice. There's more money on in that. There's more money. There are more details in the brochure. The key is you do have to be enrolled in the Board of Pensions medical program. So that's the key requirement for MedWrap.
So,
Other optional, yep.
Can I ask you just like a for instance question? I don't know what happens when ministers retire. I'm assuming they go on Medicare.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
And then they get their own supplemental insurance. There's nothing through the General Assembly or Presbytery that does anything with that.
That's changing. So so far, the Board of Pensions has had a Medicare supplement program, but they are, I think, as early as next year, they're shifting to offer more programs for Medicare for our retired ministers. I don't have those details off the top of my head, but it is something the Board of Pensions is seeing a need, because there's so many organizations selling supplements, and so the Board of Pensions as a service is saying we can do better, and this is part of what it looks like to provide care.
So if you hired a bridge pastor, for instance, that was retired, would that somewhere you had this 12% thing? Is that to pay something into Presbytery, or is that to help with their medical expenses? Or would you put something else in their contract?
Yeah, the 12% is specifically tied to pension dues. While
Okay.
yeah,
All
so
right.
that goes to the Board of Pensions.
Okay,
What will be interesting, and this is what I'm not sure how it will impact, is as the Board of Pensions provides those supplemental programs, would a church be able to elect to provide that program to somebody who is receiving Medicare, but
right,
is pastoring a church? And so those are some of the things I need to learn more about, since they will be new offerings. Currently, that's not the case, but
okay,
but my understanding is the Board of Pensions is moving in that direction.
okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
yeah. Yep, optional benefits. Some churches will, like, we require, maybe require is too strong a word. We strongly encourage the opportunity to take a sabbatical after 7 years of ministry in a call for our pastors. So some churches will provide a sabbatical fund that is paid into every year for 7 years that then the pastor can use for that sabbatical time. But there are other things based on a pastor's desires. Here's something we changed 2 years ago that I guess slipped under the radar. So across the PCUSA, vacation is minimum 4 weeks, minimum 4 weeks vacation. And just as an aside, as a pastor with who's worked with people that we haven't been able to pay necessarily what they were worth, I've often advocated that support staff like secretaries and directors of music, that the people who support the ministry should also receive 4 weeks of vacation. Like, let's not be stingy with vacation. It's good for us. That's what I advocate for. It's not in this policy. But a couple of years ago, we added that after 20 years of experience, an additional week of vacation is granted, and that is meant to be automatic. So for instance, tomorrow is my 24th anniversary of my ordination. Woo woo. When I came to this presbytery, I said I should be receiving 5 weeks of vacation. It's a standard in a lot of presbyteries, and it was a standard where I served before. And so actually that's part of the reason why we added the language. I came and I said, this is how a lot of other places do it. Why aren't we doing it? And so it was added at that point in time. So if you have a minister, and it doesn't mean 20 years in that particular church, it means the sum of experience. So after celebrating the 20th year of ordination, especially if that's all been some kind of service in the church, a 5th week of vacation is granted. The other minimum across the PCUSA is 2 weeks of study leave. And in this Presbyterian, minimum continuing education reimbursement of $500. I know my friends, $500 doesn't even get you a plane ticket to a place anymore. And most places will hardly cover a registration fee for a good program. It's woefully low. I would like that to be higher in our expectations. But for now, that is the required minimum of $500. Pastors are always welcome to negotiate for more, to say, hey, I want to take on this course of study. Again, for instance, when I came to the presbytery, I said, I want to start my doctor of ministry work. And so I negotiated for a 3rd week of continuing education and shifted some of the professional expense money so I would have a little bit more money in my continuing education line. You can advocate for that, especially if you know this is how I want to use it, but you have to use it. Vacation, if you're leaving a position, vacation can be paid out at the end of a position. Continuing education cannot. All right.
So can I ask something about those two things too?
Yep.
So there's nothing about when that can be taken. No requirement about you have to be there a year, or
It's automatic.
it can be spread out over the year when you take it, no matter when you start.
That's right. That's
So
right.
both of these need to be included in a temporary position on a prorated basis.
Yeah, on a prorated basis. So
Okay.
if you're bringing in a bridge pastor and the contract's for 6 months, then the expectation would be 2 weeks of vacation and 1 week of continuing education.
Okay.
Our terms of call typically are for a year at a time, and so typically, except in those special circumstances, will include both minimums. Yeah, and there's no like you have to work so long to earn a day of vacation, which I know can be the standard in some organizations and fields. No, it's an upfront. And part of that is we expect pastors to be responsible. We expect that part of our covenant of caring for one another means a pastor isn't going to start and then take 4 weeks of vacation. Now, some pastors will take the bulk of vacation all at one time. For a long time in New England, and I don't know if it was true here, but for a long time in New England, pastors generally took the month of August off and just they were gone for the month of August. And sometimes churches would just do minimal services. Some churches would actually close because they were all off too. And those were particular communities and particular cultures. I'd never heard of that before. But there's an expectation that there's a sense of responsibility in using these benefits. Here's the next piece that is going to be a little different. Additional personal leave. Previously, all this language that is struck out is what is in the current guidelines. And this is what we are suggesting it be replaced with. The Book of Order has changed to mandate 12 weeks paid family leave. And that is noted in this first sentence. All calls shall include a minimum of 12 weeks paid family leave, including benefits. This presbytery has already had a history of requiring paid leave for a multitude of circumstances, and you can see that in the stricken out language. So we are recommending that we go further than the Book of Order requirement, which is paid family medical leave. We're including any situations impacting family members that necessitate a time of leave. So it may not necessarily be medical, maybe, as you see, life-altering situations. So for instance, if a pastor needs to help an elderly parent move and needs to take time to help in the actual move and then help with preparing a residence for sale, that would count under additional personal leave. The purpose is we want to provide that cushion of care so that a pastor isn't required to take vacation time to do something that is by no stretch of the imagination a vacation. So it's not a vacation to care for a family member in distress. It's not a vacation. It's not a restful time. It won't rejuvenate a soul. It's hard. And I say that as somebody who has experienced that myself. So the personal leave is meant to really pay attention to the fact that we have family obligations that are essential and important. We want to honor those. Again, the Bible tells us so, but we don't want to honor those at the cost of the mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual health of our pastors. So that's the proposed language in the new guidelines for 2024. Part of what that includes is this clause. Churches can receive help. So if a pastor does need to be gone for that whole 12 weeks, and maybe that's maternity or paternity leave, or maybe that's adoption leave, maybe that's a difficult family situation that requires that kind of absence. If a church needs to get pulpit supply or needs a bridge pastor, then that's an added expense because you're continuing to pay full salary and benefits for your pastor who is absent on this personal leave. The presbytery is here to help. Again, case by case, but we will come alongside and make sure that the congregation doesn't suffer in order to provide care for the pastor. Does that make sense?
It makes, but I'm wondering about I see the minimum of 12 weeks, and let's say that's in the contract, 12 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And it's up to the pastor to use that how they want or how they need to. So you just need to keep track of that, is what I'm saying. So if I'm thinking of somebody who had a baby and took 12 weeks, and then their parent died or got sick or disabled, then they've used up that benefit. Is that what am I correct in that?
You are. And at that point, part of what we would come alongside and say, one thing should not penalize the other. And so how can we with grace respond in this unexpected circumstance? Yeah. But you're right, it's a minimum of 12 weeks. And we often can't anticipate what the needs will be. And so this is one of those places that really relies on the grace and mercy and that relationship between pastor, session, and congregation. We are just about out of time. Other forms of compensation. So that's the next piece. And then salary adjustments. There's the link to learn about cost of living. The last thing we changed that I want to lift up is we are recommending, we've had some questions as some of our churches are entering into terms of call with commission ruling elders. And so what we are recommending is that these guidelines are based on the role, and it's a pastoral role. And so this presbytery has a fairly rigorous preparation process for CREs. It's nothing like going through a Master of Divinity program, but they're being asked to serve in pastoral roles. And so we are asking to make clear that the employment and compensation guidelines apply, that it's not on some presbyteries use a percentage basis, but we're saying the role is a pastoral role and these guidelines should apply. Every year you're required to report the terms of call to the presbytery. That's so we can pay attention to things like pay equity and also be sure that that ministers are not falling below the minimum. Additional information, Board of Pensions information. It keeps going. I'm just going to go to this last page, second to last page, our fees for limited service. They did increase starting in 2023. So this is what we offer as the guidelines for preaching and worship leadership, worship participation, special services, moderating. And then the last piece is the effective salary form. And the form for 2024 is now available on the website. Whew. There's a lot of information there. And as always, I'm always happy, and Tracy would be too, if there are ever any questions, if a session wants to talk about what's in these guidelines, which need to be more fully revised. We're happy to come and have those conversations or be a resource at any time. Whew. It's a lot. Okay, next month, December, we are not having a third Thursday training, because it's December 21st. And I'm giving us all a little holiday break. January's up in the air, so watch for an email from me. I will actually be coming home from the Matthew 25 summit. So I won't be available, but I have some ideas of people who have things to share, one of which could be Tracy, to talk about what Ignite has on their plate for 2024. So my plan is that there will be a third Thursday training on January 18th. I just don't know what it will be yet. And I'll be on a plane, so it won't be me. So that was a lot. Thank you all. We are at the end of our hour. But I appreciate you tuning in. And if you have nothing else to do, in half an hour, we're offering anti-racism training. So you can come back. It's a different link, but yeah.
Thanks, Cindy.
Thank you all. Have a fantastic evening and a wonderful Thanksgiving.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.